Copper Son, Part 2, Polly, Chapter 14. The Slave Sale. Polly really didn't like Negroes. As far as she was concerned, they should all get shipped back to Africa or wherever it was they came from. They talked funny, they smelled bad, and they were ugly. How could the good Lord have made such creatures? Polly wondered as she glanced with boredom at the slave sale. Dark skin, big lips, and hair the texture of a briar brush, they were just plain unpleasant to deal with. Besides, Negroes made it difficult for regular folks like herself to get work. Who could compete with someone who worked for free? She scratched an insect bite on her arm, unrolled a sheaf of paper, and leaned against the wooden wagon of Mr. Percival Derby, owner of Derbyshire Farms. Proud of the fact that she could read, Polly looked over her certificate of indenture one more time. She mumbled and moved her lips as she read. His Majesty King George II, in the year of our Lord 1738, on this, the 2nd day of June, in the city of Charlestown, colony of South Carolina, hereby sets the indenture of one Polly Elizabeth Pritchard, age 15 years, to Mr. Percival Derby for a period not to exceed 14 years. Polly frowned. She'd not been able to shorten the 14-year term. A normal indenture was 7 years, but she had to pay off the debts of her parents, and the only way she was allowed to do that was to sign up for a double indenture. She'd have to work for Mr. Derby until she was an old woman, almost 29, but she was determined that long before that time she would have figured out a way to get out of the contract. She looked back at the slave sale. The women were wailing and acting as if something terrible was happening to them. Polly snorted and turned away. Living here in the colonies had to be better than living like a savage in the jungle. They ought to be grateful, she thought. She thought of the Negroes she'd known as a child, well-fed and happy slaves with no worries about finding employment. No, she had no sympathy. The sale was getting boisterous. Polly looked up. "Fresh from Africa," the auctioneer told the crowd. "Mold 'em into what you want 'em to be. Look at 'em, all of them healthy and ready for childbearing. Come on up and take a look. Feel free to inspect the merchandise." An unbelievably large white man, who smelled of strong wine and an even stronger body odor, waddled past Polly and up to the auction area. She covered her nose and laughed behind her hand. He seemed to have difficulty breathing. He climbed onto the riser where the Negro women stood and headed directly to the youngest one there, a girl about her own age. He opened the girl's mouth and put his fingers inside. Polly grimaced, not because she felt sorry for the girl, but because the man was so repulsive. Then the fat man touched the girl's breast and ran his hands down her legs. "Nice," Polly heard him rasp. "I'll give £10 for the girl," he said to the auctioneer, wheezing between his words. He ignored the woman standing next to the girl. "Do I hear more than £10 for this fine example of an African womanhood?" "Hardly a scratch on her. Bright enough to be taught simple commands like 'come here' and 'lie down.'" The crowd laughed at that, but Polly didn't. "£20," called a voice from the back of the crowd. The fat man looked up in astonishment. "30," he responded loudly. He sat down on the edge of the wooden platform and pulled out a filthy handkerchief. He wiped his face, which was sweating profusely. £40, called the voice from the back again. People turned to see who was outbidding the large man in the front. "She's not worth 45," the big man yelled to the crowd. "Is that your bid?" the auctioneer asked. The fat man hesitated. "Yes," he said then. "I want her." "I hear 45. Do I hear 50?" The crowd waited in anticipation. £60 for the African girl, the voice cried out at last. "I want her for my son. Today is his 16th birthday." The crowd cheered. No one seemed to want the large man to win this one. The auctioneer looked at the large man, who was still wiping his brow. "He can have her," the big man said finally. "I'll get me a young gal another day." "Sold," the auctioneer said loudly, "for £60 to Mr. Percival Derby of Derbyshire Farms." Polly looked up with surprise. She hadn't known who was doing the bidding. Then she shrugged. She just hoped Mr. Derby's new purchase would get put out in the fields where she belonged. "Will you be wanting her mamma, sir?" the auctioneer said to Mr. Derby. "I offer her to you first, out of respect, you see." Polly watched as Mr. Derby, who had walked up to the stage to claim his property, glanced at the older woman standing next to the slave girl, then said, "No, Horace, but thanks for the offer. Family ties only confuse the poor creatures. They'll forget each other as soon as the sun sets. Trust me." Mr. Derby grabbed the arm of his new slave and attempted to lead her off the stage, but for some reason, she just went wild. Polly watched, fascinated, as the girl squirmed and screeched and babbled incoherently. Polly wondered if Negroes from Africa had feelings and intelligent thoughts, or if that gibberish they spoke was more like the screaming of monkeys or the barking of dogs. When she was 5 or 6 years old, back in Beaufort, where she'd been born, she'd played with Negro children sometimes, running through the tobacco fields, playing hide and seek. But her father had frowned on such and would call Polly inside their small house. He'd say, "The company you keep will rub off on you, Polly girl. Don't get your hands dirty by dealing with darkies." Her mother would shake her head at her husband and then pull Polly close to her. "I want you to grow up to be a fine lady, my pretty Polly. I don't want you to have to do laundry like I do, so let the slave children tend to their work in the field, and I will read to you from the Bible." Polly would snuggle on her mother's lap and fall asleep listening to the rhythm of her voice as she read. Turning her attention back to the sale, Polly realized that the girl they were dragging off the auction block now was weeping real tears and seemed to be genuinely attached to that older female African whose shackled hand she wouldn't let go of. Mr. Derby slapped the girl across the face, but she continued to pull and buck on the chains. She lurched toward the woman, but her leg chains got twisted and she tumbled. She fell hard, landing at the woman's chained feet. The older woman, who was also crying, leaned down and quickly whispered something in the girl's ear. The girl was then pulled with difficulty from the stage, dragged across the dirt courtyard, and forced into the back of the wagon that Polly leaned on. The people in the crowd cheered at the spectacle, but Mr. Derby did not seem to be amused. He glared at Polly, who stepped quickly out of his way. He turned on his heel then and went to pay for his purchase. Polly watched him coolly as he strode away, his shiny black boots getting dusty as he walked. She knew he wouldn't leave right away. His son, who he had sent to pick up supplies from the wharf, had not yet returned. The bidding continued as the last of the women were sold. It seemed to Polly that the slave girl curled in the corner of the wagon would never stop crying.